got two things. Two things before we get started. Number one is, we want to wish a happy anniversary to Joe and Mona. 51, right? 51. And it's today. It's not 2 days earlier or 2 days later. And today's the day, right? And second thing is, you'll notice the, yeah, this thing, whatever it is, it's live streaming. We don't think there's going to be anybody live streaming. I don't see anybody up there. But there have been a number of people who said who wanted to be in this class, but chose to go next door. So we're recording this so people can. Right now, if anyone has an issue with recording, let me know. I hope that won't special discussion. But you can let me know privately, or does anyone want to talk about that as a group?
So they're live streamed both Sunday schools?
No, they're not, because we only have.
I know we only have one.
We only have the technology for one, and Jason would like to get the technology in this room for this class, but also he'd like to get it up on the wall. So this would be a class where we could do this kind of thing, just not for this hour, but this will be a technological classroom that we would use maybe for board meetings and whatever. But that's possibly where we're going in the future. We're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of $6,000 to do something. Well, come about right away. There has to be live discussion on that. And it's something we really need. Probably something we could use. So those are the two things. And now we're going to get started. What we've been doing for the last couple months is we've been talking about the Old Testament. We talked about some of the negative aspects of the Old Testament. We talked about some of the positive aspects of the Old Testament. And then we started, we started talking about the fact that the Old Testament was written over a long period of time, 700 to 800 years. That's really a long period of time when you think about it. And many different authors. And when that happens, something like that happens, you're going to have different views going through the Old Testament, different issues. Authors are going to come at the same issue in different ways. So we looked at this whole notion of diversity of thought in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament, and we also I kind of steered it in the way of calling it a polyphonic text because I think we have different voices running through the Old Testament, and so we talked about that especially. But that subject has come to an end. We perhaps will go back to the Old Testament, but now we're going to move into the New Testament, and we're going to do a comparison of the Gospels for the next month or two or three, however it takes us. And we're going to look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Guard the bed I lie upon, 4 pillars round my head, four pillars round my bed, 4 angels round my head. One to watch, one to pray, 2 to keep me till the day. That's a little rhyme out there, and a friend of mine who I used to teach with in graduate school, she actually wrote a book about that. Mark was the one to watch, John was the one to pray, and Matthew and Luke were ones to keep us till the day. So,
David, were there any handouts in 17?
there will be a handout, hopefully today, but there's a few things I want to say before I end that out. So, if you remember how this class started, we started with the overall contents of the New Testament. This was way back in May. last year, May of 2023. And so we just opened up the content of the New Testament. And we looked at what's listed first, the Gospels. Then there's the book of Acts, then there's the letters of Paul. And I think we all at one time, maybe we assumed growing up, or maybe we were told by someone that the Gospels were written first, letters of Paul were written second. And then we really talked about that. And over time, we've realized that no, the letters of Paul were actually written first. And they were written over a 10-year period, 51 to about 62. We think Paul died in around 62 CE. So, but the Gospels is a different story. See, when Paul writes a letter, he wrote a letter and it was done. Now, it may not have been done. Some people later may have come in and made an assertion or taken something out. But that, if he wrote a letter to the Corinthians, that was it. Now, the Gospels were written different. After Jesus died, stories, events, parables, miracles, accounts of all of these started to circulate by mouth, by word. And one person to another, one community to another, one generation to another. We're probably talking about 2 generations. And it wasn't until 70 that, around 70 CE, that the first gospel was written. And then Mark, and then around 85 or 90, you have Luke and Matthew, and then around 90 or after, we have the Gospel of John. So the Gospels were written a couple generations later. So this is one thing I want to revisit that we talked about when last May, when we started looking at the overview of the contents of the New Testament. So what happened is, when this oral tradition was going on, and after it was going on for about a generation or two, and it, in my opinion, I think it started to create somewhat of a framework as for what a gospel might look like. But a gospel had not yet been written down. And what happened was, some of the eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry and some of his disciples, they started to die. And so the early church said, we better get some of this stuff down in writing. And so that's what happened. And so you have this 1 to 2 generation of oral tradition before the Gospels were written down. So we're looking at 30, Jesus died around 33. Mark was written in 40 or 70, so what's that, 35? So we're looking at probably 40 to 60 years after Jesus died, the 4 Gospels would have been written over about a 20, 30-year time. Mark written first, John probably written last. And and we're going to say that we believe the Gospels were anonymous. Yeah, we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John attached to the Gospels, but pretty much stated they couldn't have written them, because by the time the Gospels were written down, and the early church said we really need to start committing some of this to writing, the disciples and the eyewitnesses were no longer alive. They were no longer with the community. So it wasn't until the 2nd century that the gospel started having names attached to them. And we have to understand that it was during that time period well, during ancient times, it was very common to take a name of authority and attach it to a writing to give it. I don't believe that Paul actually wrote the letters of First and Second Timothy and Titus because it's talking about a time period of a generation or two after Paul died, but attaching his name to it gave it more authority, and which eventually gave it canonical status, making it canon.
Weren't there also other gospels, a whole bunch of other gospels? Somehow came along and decided which four to actually stick in the canon.
Yeah, we actually talked about how the New Testament was formed, Pat, and you weren't here for those classes, but we did talk about the Gospel of Thomas, we talked about the Gospel of Peter, and some other gospels. So yeah, there are other gospels circulating, and some of those gospels were a little bit far out. And so, like the Gospel of Thomas, we talked about that. Thomas, that gospel really stressed the divinity of Jesus to the point that it denied the humanity of Jesus. John stresses the divinity of Jesus, but he doesn't deny the humanity. And so for Thomas to go that route, that was too far afield from whatever the orthodox theology that was being formed by the church. And so we did talk about some of the gospels, and there was a point at one time where when the gospels were being written, and then so they had already been written, and then some were questioning, well, do we need four? And so there was a thought that, well, we need to conflate or combine them down to one gospel, and the church didn't go for it. You know, we have four accounts. They came from four different communities, and we like that. So they stuck with the four gospels where there was a push by some to bring it all down. So they were anonymous, and then the names were attached, and the names that were attached were disciples of Jesus, so that probably gave more authority as well. But for the most part, and this might be hard for some of us, I know it was hard for me for a while to stick with this, but they were written anonymous. And then it's just any writing, it helps to attach a name to it. We're going to talk about Matthew and Mark. Matthew says this, but when we say Matthew says this and Mark says this, we're talking about the writer of that particular gospel. So I'll stop for any questions on that.
Dave, I hope we get into the aspect of what questions were people dealing with when they said this book is in and this book is out.
Mhm.
You know, you used the term, well, it was too far
Yeah.
out. Now, why was it too far out?
Well, the reason that Thomas was too far out is because, as I said, he was stressing the divinity of Jesus over the humanity of Jesus, and that's what we called this group. There was a group called the Gnostics, and they were into this whole notion of the divinity of Jesus, and the early church said no. Jesus was a person. He physically died on the cross. See, the Gnostics were saying Jesus pretended to die on the cross. He didn't die. So that those two thoughts were incompatible. Now that's an example. Now I'm not necessarily going to go back because we actually did talk about the formation of the Old Testament and the formation of the New Testament, we actually talked about some of those things. So, so what I want to do now is work with the comparisons of the Gospels, how Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are similar and how they differ. But if you all want to go back at some point and pick that up, we can.
My concern, what I struggle with is, did that group want everybody to believe the same thing they did? I mean, let's get everybody to believe this. And
You mean the early church?
yeah, yeah,
Not necessarily. I mean, and the fact that they allowed for 4 different gospels tells you that there was, I mean, we have maybe orthodox theology now or whatever, maybe, and as some of us get older, we kind of maybe have more of an idea of what we believe than we did in the 20s, or maybe the more we learn as we get older, the more confusing it gets. I mean, it goes both ways. But we do have to understand that the theology of the early church was forming. It wasn't set, and there wasn't an authority to say, this is it, this is it. So I think that's one reason why there was encouragement to have 4 gospels, because it allowed for some variety. But there was a line that couldn't be crossed. And we don't really know, well, we know somewhere where that line is, and had to do, the one example we've been working with is if there was a gospel that stressed the divinity of Jesus over the humanity of Jesus, then that was out. So we know the line went that far, but then there were obviously other issues and things of that nature. But things were, there was some fluidity there, and there was some room in the theology of the early church. They didn't have it all figured out yet. I don't know if we ever have it all figured out. We're still trying to figure it out today. But what we stress today is it's important to read the text. What does the text say? What doesn't it say? And then have that form our beliefs. So, any other questions or comments about how the Gospels were written? So you had an oral tradition, and then eyewitnesses started to die off, and then the early church said, well, it'd probably be a good idea that we start writing some of this stuff down, and then the Gospels were written down, but initially they were anonymous, and then names were attached to them later. So now what we want to do is talk about what gospel was written first and why. So you've heard me say, even this morning, that the Gospel of Mark was the first gospel. Now, we covered this, but it was a while ago. 8 months or so ago. So does anyone want to take a stab at why we think Mark was written first? If not, I'm going to cover it.
Well, there's evidence that the Gospel of Mark is used in Matthew and Luke heavily first, and then they kind of fleshed out some of their theology around it.
How many chapters is the Gospel of Mark? 16. How many chapters is the Gospel of Matthew? 28. And how many chapters is the Gospel of Luke? 24. So Matthew's 28, Luke's 24, and Mark is 16. And throughout history, when someone is using a source, they tend to expand upon it. So if Paul's right, I think he is. If Matthew and Mark were using, Matthew and Luke are using Mark as a source, then you tend to expand upon it as opposed to shortening. We take someone a letter and we want to, well, if you're an editor, you actually try to shorten things because sometimes people are two places, but, or they write, put words that aren't necessary. And so the editor's job is to chop it down and make it read real concise. But when we're taking something and we're working with it, we tend to expand. That's one thing. Anybody else? Paul is arguing that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source. Anybody else want to say why we think Mark was written first? Joe.
Sort of old ideas was that the author of Mark was a follower of Peter and basically collected accounts of Peter, and some feel that that's what gave a special authority. But Mark wrote, and the other gospel writer said that sort of sets the framework of everything else. We're just going to follow that framework.
Okay. There's one thing I want to say before I work on Paul's argument there. So for the most part, the Gospels are in the order that they are in by length of book. That should be a 3, 4. Now, Mark is the exception. As I said, 28 chapters to Matthew, 24 to Luke, 21 to John. Mark.
Why does they put Mark first? Mark is the first one here.
Well, number one, okay. One reason is early on, people thought Mark was an abridged version of Matthew because there's a great deal of Mark in Matthew and a great deal of Mark in Luke. And then there was a tendency for the final listing of the New Testament itself to be written or to be listed by length of book. If you look at the letters of Paul that he wrote to churches, they're listed by length of book. 1st and 2nd Corinthians, or Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians have what? I'm going to say 16 chapters. Let's see, 16 or 15. And then it goes, and then the next listing in the letters for Paul would be the letters of Paul to individuals. They're listed for the most part by length of book. So the reason Mark wasn't listed first is because number one, Matthew ties closely in. How does the Gospel of Matthew begin? Begins with a genealogy.
Oh, that's what.
So Matthew kind of is a good gospel to have first because it ties closely to the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament. And the reason Mark is second is, and not last, is because some people thought it was an abridged version. I should have gone kind of argue the other way. Think Mark that was written first, and then Matthew and Luke expanded. So I did want to throw that up, but hopefully that helps.
So the emphasis is on the chapters. If you actually looked at the number of verses, would it still be this listing? I mean,
Yeah.
John has some huge chapters with many verses.
Yeah, that's right.
I actually did a word count, and the word count does follow the chapter count.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and that's a good point. Some verses are shorter than others, some chapters are shorter and longer than others. But for the most part, And I would say that's true of the letters of Paul as well, so. Okay. Now. And this is gonna be a revisit here, but hopefully, we look at. All right, well, first thing we need to talk about is the word synoptic. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are considered to be the synoptic gospels. What does the word synoptic mean? Summary. Okay, it could be a summary.
One vision.
Could be one vision. Now, you want to say more about that, Glenn? I mean, you're on the right track in my mind.
Well, they all, although they have slightly different slants, they all have a very similar outline, very similar Christology promoted. They stress the same points of Jesus' life.
Right.
What were the high points of his life and teaching, as opposed to a very different, John has a different order of things sometimes, and different emphasis on what happened when and why, and a very different Christology of what it means to be the Christ.
Yeah.
Than those three gospels.
Yeah. Okay, and that's a pretty good summary right there by Glenn. But the word synoptic, now look at kind of the dictionary view, presenting something from a similar point of view, something that corresponds closely. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke pretty much tell the story of Jesus pretty much in the same way. As Scott pointed out, there are different slants. Each gospel has an angle or a slant or a direction that they go, but they're much closer together. And John is very different. His order is different. His structure of the gospel is different. His focus is different, and we will talk about that. But to talk about the comparisons of the gospels, it helps to start with the synoptics first, because Matthew, Mark, and Luke pretty much tell the story of Jesus in the same way as opposed to Mark. So what we need to do is we need to look at, because there are times when, because Matthew's 28 chapters, Luke's 24, and Mark is 16, there are times when Matthew will have some material in the Gospel of Matthew you don't have in Mark. And there are times when Luke will have some material in the Gospel of Luke that you won't have in Mark. So, but what we're interested right now, for the moment, is where all three Gospels are talking about the same material, the same story, the same event, the same miracle. And when this happens, when all three are talking about the same, I'm running out of. I left the lid off too long. Don't know if this will be any better. Maybe. When all three are talking about this same material, there are times when Matthew and Mark will be very, very close, and then Luke might deviate from Mark a little bit. And then there'll be times when Mark and Luke, all three are talking about the same story or the same material, and Mark and Luke are much closer, and Matthew will have some significant differences. But very rarely do we find this. very rarely do we have Matthew and Luke agreeing or having something, talking about something in verbatim and then Mark not. So what does that tell us? Mark's the common denominator. Mark would have been written first. So from an internal standpoint, from the internal evidence, we have external evidence because of the apocalypse of Mark in chapter 13. We think that's reflective of the Jewish Roman War in around 78 or CE. So some people use that as external evidence to say that Mark would have been the first gospel because it was written around 70 CE. But the internal evidence suggests that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source and Mark's the common denominator. Any questions there? Said another way, there's strong evidence in Mark and Matthew, there's strong evidence in Mark and Luke, but there's absolute or virtually no evidence of Luke in Matthew and Mark. Confusing? Okay, now, people were asking, okay, what's our next handout? We're going to do is we're going to look at a story. This is the calling of Matthew, or calling of Levi, where Jesus approaches this person. One gospel says it's Matthew, two gospels says it's Levi, and Jesus says, "Follow me." And he does it. He leaves the tax booth and he follows. Okay, we do have all the extras. Which one is mine? Yeah, that's right. Okay, now let's look at the, I've color coded this, so hopefully this is helpful. The brown font, let's go to the bottom, color coded key. The brown font is what Matthew, Mark, and Luke on this story. Now, in Matthew, it's in chapter 9, 9 to 13. In Mark, it's in chapter 2, 13 to 17. And in Luke, it's chapter 5, 27 to 32. Now, the brown font is where there are, the brown font is a bare bones of this story. And this is where all three gospels agree. And what are we going to call this? The next one. Navy blue, purplish, I don't know. You can look at different colors. All right, let's call it purple. The purple font is just Matthew and Mark, where Matthew and Mark are very, very close. The light blue, Luke and Mark, that's where Luke and Mark are very close. And the black would be Matthew only. The green, look at the top of Mark's column. The green is Mark only. And then you see more green down there too. You don't really see a lot of black in Matthew up at the first sentence and the last verse. And then what's Luke only is red. So the bare bones of the story is, but there are several things going on here. One is that there's someone sitting at a tax, and Jesus goes to that person, says, "Follow me," and the person got up and followed Jesus. Now there are differences. We'll come back and we'll hit those. No need to get those right now. Then, that's the first part of this. Then the setting changes and they're at a house. And the Pharisees are there. All three agree on that. And they basically say to the disciples, why do you and Jesus, why do you eat with tax collectors and sinners? That's the second part. The third part is Jesus' response by Jesus. Jesus says, those who are well and have no need of a physician, those who are well have no need of a physician, but only those who are sick. Therefore, he has come to call the righteous not sinners. I have come. So that's the bare bones. Are you with me on that? And that's where all three gospels agree. It's in the brown font. Now let's begin to look at some of the specific differences. Look at how Mark begins the gospel. Matthew and Luke basically begin the gospel with Jesus walking along and seeing this man at the tax booth. But Mark adds a little bit at the beginning. He went out again beside the sea. The whole crowd gathered around him and he taught them. And then as he was walking along, he saw this person sitting at the tax booth. So Mark adds that, wants to stress that Jesus was a teacher and that he was being followed by a crowd. And if Matthew and Luke are following Mark, they chose not to do that because this is later on in their stories, certainly Matthew and in Luke. So they've already demonstrated that Jesus is doing this kind of thing, teaching by the sea and crowds. Now, they all agree that Jesus encountered a person at a tax booth. But Matthew says it's Matthew. Mark says the name is Levi, son of Alphaeus probably. Son of Alphaeus, and then Luke just is Levi. So, but both Luke and Mark agree that it's Levi. Matthew, if Matthew is using Mark as a source, Matthew changes it to Matthew instead of Luke. So now we don't really know why the writer of Matthew names the tax collector Matthew. One good theory out there, one good guess is perhaps Matthew felt that the tax collector was one of the 12, and so then he said, if you look at the listing of the 12 disciples by all three gospels, and even John's gospel, and even in the book of Acts has a listing, Levi's not there. The name Levi. So Levi's not a disciple. Matthew makes that a disciple and makes this person a disciple. And I think we've been taught that down through the years, that Matthew was a tax collector and Jesus came, called him, and he became, this tax collector became one of the disciples of Jesus. Now, is it a surprise that Mark and Luke are not saying that? Levi's not a disciple. He's just a person who got up to follow Jesus. And according to Luke, he left everything to follow Jesus. That's in red. And he got up, left everything. Two think that Matthew made the change because he wanted to make the point that the person, the disciple Matthew started that. And I think that's of the three versions of the story. I think I'm correct on this. You tell me if I'm wrong. We, as in the church, we tended to focus on the Matthew, the tax collector, as opposed to Levi. Do you agree with that?
What if it was another Matthew,
What's that?
not Matthew the disciple, but another name?
Oh, yeah, well, it could have been.
Well, I think that, but
Well, and that's why we
Comparison
say it's a
makes
guess,
no
because it could have been another Matthew. There's nothing to say that this Matthew became the disciple.
Is it likely that these three writers were contemporaries of each other?
Yes. Certainly Luke and Matthew, but were they writing, did they know each other? And were they writing in the same areas and things like that? And so when we get through this, I thought this would be important to do a little exercise like this. When we're done with this, then we're gonna look at what we think the communities out of which each gospel emerged initially. Then it evolved, choose, but by different communities. But, and we can get clues internally from the gospels. Now, we're not going to be able to nail it down, Jim. We're not, it's just going to be guesses.
It just struck me that some of the quotes attributed to Jesus are almost verbatim alike in all three, and I wonder, how did that happen?
Well, the reason we think it happened is that somehow, Mark was written first, and somehow Luke and Matthew got a hold of Mark, and they were using it as a source. And then we get back to here. Why are there times when Matthew is very close to Mark, when they're talking about the same story, and Luke goes a different direction? And then why are there times when Mark and Luke are very close, and Matthew goes a different direction? I just think and that probably has to do with background, the community that they're writing out of. There is one difference. Luke, I think, talks about, this story about the people are lowering the lame person down through the roof. Well, we think Mark might have been in a more urban setting, and it says tiles. It was a roof with tiles. They removed the tiles. In Mark's gospel, which we think may have been in a more agrarian or rural setting, it's a muddy roof, and they dig a hole in the roof. They ruined the roof. It was leaked. But so that is reflective of perhaps different cultural.
Didn't they sometimes change their names once they became a disciple? Because my Bible is saying that Matthew wrote it, but they have Matthew/Levi. As
Yeah.
writing this book. So could Levi be Matthew? Did Levi take Matthew as his name when he became a disciple?
It's possible. Some would make that argument, especially if it's important for people to think that Matthew and Levi were the same person. I've always said, stick with the text. What does the text say? Matthew says it's Matthew, and Mark and Luke say it's Levi. So I'm starting from the assumption that Matthew and Levi are two different people, the authors. But there are some who are going to feel that some people don't like all the differences. So there's always going to be explanations as to why they don't agree and why they do agree.
So the list of disciples in Matthew has Matthew the tax collector. It has that after his name.
Does it?
Yeah,
Okay, well then,
and that's in Matthew chapter 10, verse 2. It says Matthew the tax collector, and then at least in my version. Put it that way. And then in Luke, it doesn't say that, it just has
Oh.
Matthew listed. So,
okay, does everyone have a Bible?
But it's James, son of Alphaeus. James is the son of Alphaeus. So
Yeah,
Levi
well-
is the son of Alphaeus, brother.
Okay, and we don't have time to do this, but, we may do it. If you, compare the different lists of the disciples, they don't agree, especially the three. And then John doesn't have a listing of disciples, but in John 1, chapter 1, he does have disciples who are following Jesus. So it's possibly thinking that Nathaniel was a disciple because he was a strong follower of Jesus. And so when you look at it, you just don't have 12 disciples, but when you compare all of them, you end up with 15 disciples. Because the lists don't always agree. There's one listing that has one Judas, another listing that has two Judas. So I'm just going to leave that for now. Paul did the research. If you want to look at the listings of the disciples, it's Matthew 10. I think it's, what is it, 2 and 3? And then in Mark, it's 3, 16 to 19. And in Luke, it's 6, 13 to 16. Why don't we just do that? And then let's just look at those listings. And then that'll finish us out for today. We're not going to get through this thing. So let's go to Matthew 10, verse 3. Does anyone need a Bible? Anybody else? Yeah, you could have. So 10. And it's best, I would make a handout so you can see them all. I haven't done that. I've done it in other classes. So, Simon, also known as Peter, Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, and Matthew, as Paul says, the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus, not Matthew, and Thaddeus, Simon, the Canaan, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. And remember, Mark is the one who said that Levi was the son of Alphaeus and not James.
David, what did you say about Simon? Because I have it as Simon the Zealot.
Simon, the Canaan,
What's the difference?
could be the manuscript. I don't have a footnote. But because
Mine says the Zealots were Jewish nationalists who opposed the Roman occupation. of
Yeah.
Christ.
But why does, I'm thinking one manuscript might have said Canaan and another manuscript might have said Zealot.
So one's calling him a Democrat, but the other one's calling him a, by his, where he came from.
Could be.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Political consideration. Okay.
Because I don't, I don't necessarily think that the word Canaan meant zealot. So I'd have to do more research on it. Okay, so right now I'm thinking that just might be the difference in manuscript. Let's go to Mark 3, 16 to 19. Okay, here we go. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter. James, son of Zebedee. John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name, Boanerges. Boanerges. That is the sons of Ungar, and Andrew, and Philip, Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and Simon. So it? Okay. That says the king of the and Judas Iscariot. And let's go quickly to Luke 6:13 to 16. You might want to try to have a finger on all three. Possibly.
You said Luke 6.
Luke 6:13 to 16. Luke 6:13 to 16. See if we can get some differences here, maybe. 13. It starts with 14, really. Simon, whom he named Peter, and his brother Andrew, and James, and John, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot. So you have two Judases here. So if we took the time, and maybe you can do this on your own, you would see we have two Judases that is different. I think what's missing here is a Thaddeus, Luke. We had that in was in Matthew and in Mark. Right. And there might be another difference. Okay. Now we're getting into the text. I've been wanting to do this. But you're seeing, the differences. Subtle differences. Exactly, Mark. We'll pick that up next time. But if you take these 12 or these listings of disciples, write them down, and then you put them side by side, and you're going to see some difference. The world comments, and it just a person might be listed in one, it's not in another. Yes, go ahead.
There's a long footnote here about this in Matthew in my Bible. It's
Yeah, go ahead.
I found interesting, so I'll try to skim through and get out the points, but what it's saying is that although the names and the orders vary, what is common across all three is that they're grouped in three groups of 4 names. The first group being 4 of who were most closely associated with Jesus, most friendly with Jesus. The second group, the third group was the one that were the most tenacious about sticking with Jewish law. And the middle group were the ones that were more associated with people outside, that interacted more with people outside the Jewish community, like not like the tax collectors.
Yeah.
So there's that structure to all of the lists, even if they vary in individual order and in the name that's there, but there's that 3 groups of 4 in that order.
And it will be interesting to really look into that, see if that actually plays out. There, And what's your study Bible?
This is the Jerusalem Bible.
Christian Bible. Okay. So that's the case with everything. Even though there might be differences, similarity in the structure. So, yeah, when we start looking at these different versions, then, we are left with, hey, we just don't want to point out the differences as much as you can. You do want to say, yes, why? Why did you have to go this way? Yeah,
The Oneida lexicon
Yeah.
claims that Canaan is the Aramaic equivalent of the Greek Zolates.
okay. I was thinking it was a manuscript difference, but there actually can be, you know, language equivalent or cognate or connection.
Can you say that again? Because I missed it.
Yeah.
Okay, the Oneida lexicon, which is a pretty good academic one, it claims that the one word Canaan refers to an Aramaic equivalent to the Greek word Zolates.
Oh, okay. I didn't have that.
The zealot, yeah.
So that's why, Kate, you had the zealot. Okay, well, we're done for today. You're out of time. Yeah, sorry, we went a little over. But, and we'll pick this up next time. So if you want this handout to take it home and look at it and fine, and if you think you'll bring it back, fine. If not, put it up here. So we don't run out. That's up to you.